The sinister truth behind Annie Oakley. She wasn't America's sweetheart by choice. That line isn't a tease. It's a crack in the glass. Annie Oakley, the smiling miracle with a rifle, was sold to America as purity with perfect aim. Posters called her Little Sure Shot. Headlines praised her modesty. Crowds rose to their feet. But the legend was engineered by showmen building a nation's myth and by newspapers hungry for a fall from grace. Before we fire the first shot, help this investigation reach more people. Subscribe, hit like, and tell us in the comments which legend we should unmask next. Now back to Annie. This episode follows the paper trail behind the photographs. We'll watch how Buffalo Bill's Wild West turned a survivor into a symbol, how the press almost erased her with one lie, and how Annie fought to reclaim her name without raising her voice. We'll decode the costume, the posture, and the silences she kept, searching for the woman who refused to disappear inside a role. To start, we'll step into the light of the arena, where America first learned to love her, and listen to the story they wanted you to hear. The legend. She was born in a log cabin, the fifth of 7 children, with little more than a broken rifle and a steady hand. Annie Oakley, the darling of the Wild West, dazzled crowds with her precision shooting, hitting dimes out of the air and splitting playing cards at 50 feet. In the minds of millions, she wasn't just a performer. She was the embodiment of the American dream in lace and leather. She toured the world, earned the respect of royalty, and became the face of wholesome femininity with deadly aim. To the public, she was everything America wanted to believe about itself. Talented, humble, pure. Newspapers called her Little Sure Shot. She was featured in cigarette ads, posed for portraits in Victorian dresses with a rifle in hand, and smiled politely while surrounded by men. It was a perfect contradiction. A woman with lethal power, neatly packaged and never threatened the patriarchy. The stories focus on her charm, her modesty, her refusal to curse or drink. What they didn't show were the decisions behind that image, and who controlled them. Annie, it seemed, was a legend made to sue the country in need of symbols. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was a stage that made her a household name. Every evening she performed before roaring crowds, competing against men and consistently outperforming them. But she never got equal billing. She was never allowed to appear too dominant, too fierce. Her sharpest skills were often softened by commentary, insisting she was just a girl with talent. Behind the scenes, her image was curated by male managers, editors, and showmen who knew how to make profit from paradox, a deadly woman who never looked dangerous. Yet even as the applause rang through packed arenas, there was something off about how they talked about her. Interviews were filled with scripted answers. Her personal life was blurred, her opinions rarely recorded. The Annie that people saw was one crafted for them, a delicate ornament holding a gun. But the truth is, no one asked what it cost her to hold that pose for so long. The more beloved she became, the more trapped she was in the very image that made her famous. That's the Annie Oakley the world thinks it knows, a smiling sharpshooter who lived a dream. But beneath the polished portraits and rehearsed routines, a different story was quietly waiting to be heard. And it starts with a lie told by a newspaper, a lie that almost destroyed her. The late 1800s in America were a time of reconstruction, spectacle, and manufactured dreams. After the Civil War, the country was desperate for new heroes, and few stages sold those dreams better than Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It wasn't just entertainment. It was nation-building through performance. Cowboys were reinvented, Native Americans were turned into props, and women like Annie Oakley became symbols tailored for mass appeal. She wasn't chosen for who she was, but for what she represented. A contradiction the public would devour. A woman deadly enough to impress men, yet dainty enough to not threaten them. At the heart of her rise was William Buffalo Bill Cody, part showman, part mythmaker. He understood the emotional pulse of the American audience and turned performers into archetypes. Annie became the angel of the West, a bullet-wielding lady that reassured a nation torn by war and gender shifts. But Cody was not just crafting stories for the stage. He was shaping narratives in newspapers, posters, and public perception. The real Annie disappeared behind press releases and glowing editorials, which rarely reflected her own voice. A mini twist shattered that illusion in 1903. Multiple newspapers published front-page stories claiming Annie Oakley had been arrested for stealing to fund a cocaine addiction. It wasn't true. The woman in question had merely used Annie's name, but the damage was instant and wide. Dozens of outlets reprinted the lie without checking, and her pristine image, carefully built over decades, nearly crumbled overnight. Annie fought back with vengeance. Over the next 6 years, she filed 55 libel suits against the newspapers that had slandered her, and won almost every single one. But the question remains, why did they believe it so quickly? Why was the public so ready to accept that their national sweetheart had fallen? It wasn't just sensationalism. It was control. The newspapers had helped make her, and now they were testing how easily they could unmake her. Annie Oakley had become so iconic that her real self no longer mattered. Only the version they could profit from did. In many ways, the newspapers owned her more than she ever owned her own story. She was fighting not just for her name, but for her autonomy, something she'd lost long before the scandal. And the more she tried to reclaim it, the clearer it became that the legend they sold was never truly hers. That realization opens the door to the truth the public never saw. The woman behind the gun wasn't aiming to please, but to be free. Long before she became a headline, Annie was a girl named Phoebe and Mosey. Her father died when she was just 6, leaving the family destitute in rural Ohio. By the age of 9, she was bound out to a local family under the pretense of domestic help. In truth, she was treated like a slave, beaten, starved, and forced to sleep outside during winter. Annie would later refer to them only as the Wolves. These weren't the makings of a national icon. They were the early scars of someone who learned, far too young, that survival meant silence. She escaped the wolves but never forgot them. By 12, she was hunting game to feed her siblings and selling it to hotels and restaurants. Her accuracy became legendary locally, but it was born from desperation, not performance. She didn't shoot to impress. She shot to eat. That hard edge never left her. Even when she met Frank Butler, a vaudeville marksman who would become her husband. During a shooting competition, she beat him, and instead of being threatened, he fell in love. But even that love came with conditions. Annie had to shrink herself publicly, often billed as Mrs. Frank Butler, her identity tied to his. Despite the crowd and applause, Annie lived a life of quiet defiance. She rejected offers that asked her to pose provocatively or exaggerate her femininity. She sewed her own modest costumes. She refused to adopt a stage name. But behind the controlled persona, there was a constant fight to be respected as a shooter, as a woman, and as someone more than a figurehead. When the scandal of 1903 hit, it wasn't just her image that was attacked. It was her life's work. And when she sued those newspapers, it wasn't about money. It was about finally, publicly saying, "You don't own me." After years of travel in courtrooms, her health began to deteriorate. She had been in a car accident, endured multiple surgeries, and developed anemia, but she kept performing for as long as her hands could lift a rifle. Frank, loyal to the end, retired alongside her. But their final years were marked not by grandeur, but by retreat. Annie's story ended not on a stage, but in silence, far from the lights, the posters, and the people who never truly knew her. And yet, even as she faded from the spotlight, the legend lived on. But it wasn't her legend. It was the one built atop her pain, her discipline, and her survival. And if you looked closely, the woman behind the myth had always been trying to tell a different story. One not of glory, but of grit. Annie's rifle was more than a tool. It was her voice in a world that refused to listen. In a time when women were expected to be silent, gentle, and ornamental, she chose precision, force, and spectacle. But even those choices were wrapped in layers of compromise. She carried her weapon like a second skin, a barrier between herself and society eager to consume her, as long as she remained silent about her pain. Her bullets weren't just hitting targets. They were carving space in a world where she was constantly told she didn't belong. Her clothing told another story. Annie never dressed in the flashy styles of other performers. She sewed modest, functional costumes herself, muted tones, high collars, long sleeves. It was an armor disguised as tradition. These weren't fashion choices. They were lines drawn between dignity and exposure. She knew that one wrong move, one deviation from the image they allowed her, could destroy everything. And so she performed every night not just with skill, but with restraint, calculating exactly how far she could go without crossing the invisible line of acceptability. The silence she kept about her past was equally powerful. She never wrote a full autobiography. She rarely spoke of her childhood. To many, that silence was humility, but it was also protection. Annie understood that a woman's truth was rarely welcomed unless it fit a palatable mold. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. By refusing to feed the myth, she protected the fragments of herself that had not yet been consumed by the public machine. Each symbol, the rifle, the sewing needle, the silence, became a language, a form of resistance hidden in plain sight. Annie Oakley was celebrated for her accuracy, but few noticed the precision of how she crafted her own containment. She walked a tightrope daily, giving just enough to the legend so it would leave her real self alone. But even that wasn't always enough. The world still came for her, branding her, editing her, and eventually forgetting what she had refused to say. Her entire life became a paradox, visible and invisible, adored and misunderstood. But those who truly look, who read the symbols she left behind, begin to see not a legend, but a woman fighting to exist on her own terms. A woman who fired her rifle not at enemies, but at the expectations that tried to erase her. Annie Oakley died in 1926 quietly, with far less applause than she had earned. Just 18 days later, Frank Butler followed. As if his life could not continue without her, the nation remembered her as a symbol of American grace, a marvel with a gun, a lady who never aimed to offend. But what they never acknowledged was how carefully that version of her had been curated. Annie never got to say what she really thought of the system that both raised and caged her, because every time she tried to speak, to be angry, political, complex, they shut the door with a smile. She wasn't allowed to be angry. Not about the men who stole her childhood. Not about the press that tried to destroy her. Not about the country that praised her skills but refused her leadership. She was only allowed to aim, shoot, and smile. But beneath the surface, Annie carried a quiet rage, not explosive, but enduring. It lived in the creases of her letters, the careful phrasing of her public statements, and the lawsuits she filed when her name was stolen. She may not have shouted, but she made herself heard. Her life reminds us that legends are often prisons. Annie Oakley was mythologized as the perfect blend of feminine virtue and masculine power, a woman who never made waves. But the truth is, she made waves every day just by surviving on her own terms, by not performing sexuality for the male gaze, by refusing to be a caricature, by shooting better than most men and still demanding to be called a woman, not a freak. That was her quiet rebellion. That was her fire. And in that silence, she spoke for millions, for women forced to be perfect and polite, even when fighting to survive, for those whose stories were edited for comfort, for those still waiting to be allowed complexity. Annie Oakley's real legacy isn't the shots she fired, but in the words they never let her say, and in the truth that finally, someone is telling now. Maybe she wasn't America's sweetheart by choice, but she was always something far more dangerous, a woman who refused to disappear. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to our channel for more untold truths behind America's most beloved legends. Like, share, and comment below what surprised you most about Annie Oakley's real story. And if you want to support this project and help us uncover even more hidden histories, become a member today. More stories like this are coming, and you won't want to miss the next revelation.